Hi guys, so I'm going to be reading some of your chapter book read aloud, and we are actually only on page 16. So we haven't gotten very far, but I do want to remind you what we've been reading about. This is a series of unfortunate events, the bad beginning. You all really wanted me to read this story, so I really want to keep reading this for you, and maybe I'll even get to a second book before the end of the year. So I will do about 15 to 20 minutes of chapter book read aloud, just depending on, how far I get each time. So they were the kids. There's 3 kids, the Baudelaire children. You guys know I also have a hard time saying that word. And that's okay. They are at Mr. Poe's house, and Mr. Poe is telling them about Count Olaf being related to them, and the kids are saying they never heard of such person, and they are kind of confused on what he really is or who he really is. So I'm going to begin reading. I hope you enjoy, and I also hope you use your chapter book journal. I thought he was a count, Klaus said. He is both a count and an actor, Mr. Poe said. Now, I don't mean to cut short our dinner, but you children have to pack up your things, and I have to return to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I am very busy myself. The 3 Baudelaire children had many more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table and with a slight wave of his hand departed from the room. They heard him coughing into his handkerchief, and then the front door creaked shut as he left the house. "Well," Mrs. Poe said, "you 3 better start packing. Edgar, Albert, please help me clear the table." The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and glumly packed their few belongings. Klaus looked distastefully at each ugly shirt Mrs. Poe had bought for him as he folded them and put them into a small suitcase. Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sunny crawled around solemnly, biting each of Edgar's and Albert's shoes, leaving small teeth marks in each one so she would not be forgotten. From time to time, the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their future such a mystery, they could think of nothing to say. At bedtime, they tossed and turned all night, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert and their own worried thoughts. Finally, Mr. Poe knocked on the door and stuck his head into the bedroom. "Rise and shine, Baudelaire's," he said. "It's time for you to go to Count Olaf's." Violet looked around the crowded bedroom, and even though she didn't like it, she felt very nervous about leaving. "Do we have to go right this minute?" she asked. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough a few times before he began. "Yes, you do. I'm dropping you off on my way to the bank, so we need to leave as soon as possible. Please, get out of bed and get dressed," he said briskly. The word briskly here means quickly, so as to get the Baudelaire children to leave the house. The Baudelaire children left the house. Mr. Poe's automobile rumbled along the cobblestone streets of the city toward the neighborhood where Count Olaf lived. They passed horse-drawn carriages and motorcycles along Doldrum Drive. They passed the Fickle Fountain, an elaborately carved monument that occasionally spat out water in which young children played. They passed an enormous pile of dirt where the royal gardens once stood. Before too long, Mr. Poe drove his car down a narrow alley lined with houses made of pale brick and stopped halfway down the block. "Here we are," Mr. Poe said in a voice undoubtedly meant to be cheerful. "Your new home." But the Baudelaire children looked out and saw the prettiest house on the block. The bricks had been cleaned very well, and though the wide and open windows could see an assortment of well-groomed plants, Standing in the doorway with her hand on a shiny brass doorknob was an older woman, smartly dressed, who was smiling at the children. In one hand she carried a flower pot. "Hello there," she called out. "You must be the children Count Olaf is adopting." Violet opened the door of the automobile and got out to shake the woman's hand. It felt firm and warm, and for the first time in a long while, Violet felt as if her life and the lives of her siblings might turn out well after all. "Yes," she said, "yes, we are. I'm Violet Baudelaire, and this is my brother Klaus and my sister Sunny. And this is Mr. Poe, who has been arranging things for us since the death of our parents." "Yes, I heard about the accident," the woman said. As everyone said, "How do you do? I am Justice Stratus." "That's an unusual first name," Klaus remarked. "It is my title," she explained, "not my first name. I serve as a judge on the High Court." "How fascinating," Violet said. "And are you married to Count Olaf?" "Goodness me, no," Justice Stratus said. "I don't actually know him very well. He is my next-door neighbor." The children looked from the well-scrubbed house of Justice Stratus to the weird one next door. The bricks were stained with soot and grime. There were only 2 windows, which were closed with the shades drawn, even though it was a nice day. Rising above the windows was a tall and dirty tower and that tilted slightly to the left. The front door needed to be repainted, and carved in the middle of it was an image of an eye. The entire building sagged to the side like a crooked tooth. "Oh," said Sunny, and everyone knew what she meant. She meant, "What a terrible place! I don't want to live here at all." "Well, it was nice to meet you," Violet said to Justice Stratus. "Yes," said Justice Stratus, gesturing to her flower pot. "Perhaps one day you could come over and help me with my gardening." "That would be really pleasant," Violet said, very sadly. It would, of course, be very pleasant to help Justice Stratus with her gardening, but Violet could not help thinking that it would be far more pleasant to live in Justice Stratus's house instead of Count Olaf's. What kind of man, Violet wondered, would carve an image of an eye into his front door? Mr. Poe tipped his hat to Justice Stratus, who smiled at the children and disappeared into her lovely house. Klaus stepped forward and knocked on Count Olaf's door, his knuckles rapping right in the middle of the carved eye. There was a pause, then the door creaked open, and the children saw Count Olaf for the first time. "Hello, hello, hello!" Count Olaf said. He was very tall and very thin, dressed in a gray suit that had many dark stains on it. His face was unshaven, and rather than 2 eyebrows like most human beings have, he had just one long one. His eyes were very, very shiny, which made him look both hungry and angry. "Hello, my children. Please step into your new home and wipe your feet outside so no mud gets indoors." As they stepped into the house, Mr. Poe, behind them, the Baudelaire orphans realized what a ridiculous thing Count Olaf had just said. The room in which they found themselves was the dirtiest they had ever seen. A little bit of mud from outdoors wouldn't have made a bit of a difference, even by the dim light of the one bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling. The 3 children could see that everything in this room was filthy, from the stuffed head of a lion, which was nailed to the wall, to the bowl of apple cores, which sat on a small wooden table. Klaus willed himself not to cry as he looked around. "This room looks like it needs a little work," Mr. Poe said, peering around in the gloom. "I realized that my humble home isn't as fancy as the Baudelaire mansion," Count Olaf said, "but perhaps with a bit of your money, we could fix it up a little nicer." Mr. Poe's eyes widened in surprise, and his coughs echoed in the dark room before they spoke. The Baudelaire fortune, he said sternly, will not be used for such manners. In fact, it will not be used at all until Violet is of age. Count Olaf turned to Mr. Poe with a glint in his eye like an angry dog. For a moment, Violet thought he was going to strike Mr. Poe across the face. But then he swallowed. The three children could see his Adam apple bob in his skinny throat and shrugged his patchy shoulders. "All right, then," he said. "It's the same to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Poe, for bringing them here. Children, I will show you to your room." "Goodbye, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny," Mr. Poe said, stepping back through the front door. "I hope you will be very happy here. I will continue to see you occasionally, and you can always contact me at the bank if you have any questions." "But we don't even know where the bank is," Klaus said. "I have a map of the city," Count Olaf said. "Goodbye, Mr. Poe." He leaned forward to shut the door, and the Baudelaire orphans were too overcome with the despair to get a last glimpse of Mr. Poe. They now wished they could all stay at the Poe household, even though it smelled. Rather than looking out the door then, the orphans looked down and saw that although Count Olaf was wearing shoes, he wasn't wearing any socks. They could see in the space of pale skin between his tattered torso cuff and his black shoe that Count Olaf had an image of an eye tattooed on his ankle, matching the eye on his front door. They wondered how many other eyes were in Count Olaf's house, and whether for the rest of their lives they would always feel as though Count Olaf were watching them when he wasn't even nearby. Chapter 3. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but my first impressions are entirely wrong. You can look at a painting for the first time and, for example, and not like it at all. But after looking at it a little longer, you may find it very pleasing. The first time you try gorgonzola cheese, you may find it too strong. But when you get older, you may want to eat nothing but gorgonzola cheese. Klaus, when Sunny was born, did not like her at all. But by the time she was 6 weeks old, the two of them were thick as thieves. Your initial opinion on just about anything may change over time. I wish I could tell you that the Baudelaire's first impression of Count Olaf and his house were incorrect, as first impressions are often so. But these impressions, that Count Olaf was a horrible person and his house a depressing pigsty, were absolutely correct. During the first few days after the orphans' arrival at Count Olaf's, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny attempted to make themselves feel at home, but it was really no use. Even though Count Olaf's house was quite large, the three children were placed together in one filthy bedroom that had only one small bed in it. Violet and Klaus took turns sleeping on it, so that every other night one of them was in the bed and the other was sleeping on the hard wooden floor, and the bed's mattress was so lumpy, it was difficult to say who was more uncomfortable. To make a bed for Sunny, Violet removed the dusty curtains from the curtain rod that hung over the bedroom's one window and bunched them together to form a sort of cushion, just big enough for her sister. However, without curtains over the cracked glass, the sun streamed through the window every morning, so the children woke up early and sore each day. Instead of a closet, there was a large cardboard box that had once held a refrigerator and would now hold the three children's clothes all piled in a heap. Instead of toys, books, or other things to amuse the youngsters, Count Olaf had provided a small pile of rocks, and the only decoration of the peeling walls was a large and ugly painting of an eye, matching the one on Count Olaf's ankle and all over the house. But the children knew, as I'm sure you know, that the worst surroundings in the world could be tolerated if the people in them are interesting and kind. Count Olaf was neither interesting nor kind. He was demanding, short-tempered, and bad-smelling. The only good thing to be said for Count Olaf is that he wasn't around very often. When the children woke up and chose their clothing out of the refrigerator box, they would walk into the kitchen and find a list of instructions left for them by Count Olaf, who would often not appear until nighttime. Most of the day he spent out in the house or up in the high tower where the children were forbidden to go. The instructions he left for them were usually difficult chores, such as repainting the back porch or repairing the windows, and instead of a signature, Count Olaf would draw an eye at the bottom of the note. One morning, his note read, "My theater troupe will be coming for dinner before tonight's performance. Have dinner ready for all 10 of them by the time they arrive at 7 o'clock. Buy the food, prepare it, set the table, serve dinner, clean up afterwards, and stay out of our way." Below that, there was the usual I, and underneath the note was a small sum of money for the groceries. Violet and Klaus read the note as they ate their breakfast, which was a gray and lumpy oatmeal Count Olaf left for them each morning in a large pot on the stove. Then they looked at each other in dismay. "None of us know how to cook," Klaus said. "That's true," Violet said. "I knew how to repair those windows and how to clean the chimney because those sorts of things interest me, but I don't know how to cook anything except toast." "And sometimes you burn the toast," Klaus said, and they smiled. They were both remembering a time when the two of them got up early to make a special breakfast for their parents. Violet had burned the toast, and their parents, smelling smoke, had run downstairs to see what the matter was. When they saw Violet and Klaus looking forlornly at pieces of pitch-black toast, they laughed and laughed, and then made pancakes for the whole family. "I wish they were here," Violet said. She did not have to explain. She was talking about their parents. "They would never let us stay in this dreadful place." "If they were here," Klaus said, his voice rising as he got more and more upset, "we would not be with Count Olaf in the first place. I hate it here, Violet. I hate this house. I hate our room. I hate having to do all these chores. And I hate Count Olaf." "I hate it too," Violet said, and Klaus looked at his older sister with relief. Sometimes just saying that you hate something and having someone agree with you can make you feel better about a terrible situation. "I hate everything about our lives right now, Klaus," she said, "but we have to keep our chin up." This was an expression the children's father had used, and it meant try to stay cheerful. "You're right," Klaus said, "but it was very difficult to keep one's chin up when Count Olaf keeps shoving it down." "Jook!" Sunny shrieked, banging on the table with her oatmeal spoon. Violet and Klaus were jerked out of their conversation and looked once again at Count Olaf's note. "Perhaps we could find a cookbook and read about how to cook," Klaus said. "It shouldn't be that difficult to make a simple meal." Violet and Klaus spent several minutes opening and shutting Count Olaf's kitchen cupboards, but there wasn't any cookbooks to be found. "I can't see him surprised," Violet said. "We haven't found any books in this house at all." "I know," Klaus said miserably. "I miss reading so very much. We must go out and look for a library sometime soon." "But not today," Violet said. "We have to cook for 10 people. At that moment, there was a knock on the front door. Violet and Klaus looked at one another nervously. Who in the world would want to visit Count Olaf? Wondered Violet out loud. Okay, and that is where I am going to stop reading. Okay, you guys, I hope you enjoyed the chapter book read aloud.